Hey everybody, it's Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to be showing you my favorite, pretty much foolproof way to put in a t-shirt neckline, otherwise known as a neckband. So this will take some practice. It's not exactly a first try will be perfect sort of method, but I do have a few tips and a few tricks that are going to help this be a lot easier than you think it is, and something that you can achieve. Okay, so many of my free patterns are t-shirts, whether they're raglans or a regular sort of cut t-shirt, and I have along the way come up with several shortcuts and tricks that help me to really get a great looking neckline. And I'm going to show you today whether you have a serger and a cover stitch, or whether you're just using your regular sewing machine or any combination of those, how to achieve a great looking t-shirt neckline. So this is a tutorial that you can follow along, or you can watch and then kind of come back and just check out the parts that you really need. So we're going to get started by taking a look at some of the materials that are a necessity for your t-shirt. So of course you will have your actual shirt that you're sewing. Okay, so I've cut out a fake little t-shirt here, and usually most t-shirts, men's or women's, the front neckline is cut a little bit lower than the back neckline. Okay, so you can see here we have the front cut lower than the back. Now, you can use the same fabric, so just cut a neckband out of the same knit, or you can use a couple of other things. So some options for other things you might use include ribbed knit, or also I sometimes like to, if I'm getting rid of a t-shirt, I pick off the old neckband and I reuse that for a new t-shirt. Okay, so those are those are the three materials that I use when I'm making neckbands. Either cutting a strip of fabric from the same fabric, using an old t-shirt neckband, or using some rib knit fabric. Okay, so it's harder to find rib knit that is an exact match. You'll notice when you buy from a store, they have achieved an exact match and they're printing their own fabric. So when you're looking at rib knit on fabric.com or at Joann's or wherever you're looking, there's only a few choices. So I usually keep the basics on hand: a cream, a white, a brown, a black. Sometimes I'll have a red or a green because I often am sewing Christmas pajamas, but there's not as many options. So that's just something to keep in mind. I would say 90% of the time I'm just cutting a strip of fabric from the same fabric that I'm cutting my t-shirt from. Okay, so let's start with the first step in sewing up your t-shirt neckline. And the first thing that I like to do is sew one of the shoulder seams. So with right sides together, you're going to place your fabric and you're going to sew. So you're going to place your fabric with right sides together and pin or clip one of the shoulder seams, and we will begin by sewing that. So this first t-shirt, I'm going to demonstrate using a serger and a cover stitch, and then we'll walk through it again using just a plain sewing machine, or just a regular sewing machine. Okay, so I've got one shoulder clipped, and let's go over and sew it on the serger. All right, so this is really simple. We have simply pinned one shoulder, and I'm going to sew it with the seam allowance for whatever pattern you are using my serger. Of course, I will walk through this again, like I said, using the sewing machine, but for now this is the serger version. Okay, so now we have a neckline that we can open up with one shoulder seam sewn. Okay, so now we have our shoulder seam, and we're going to open it up to determine how long to cut the neckband. And this is actually the most important thing when you're trying to get a good neckband is cutting it the appropriate size. I really like to sew it with one shoulder seam open because that allows you to get a great fit even if your measurement is a little bit off. So, but we do want to measure. So now we have our front, which is cut a little bit lower, and our back, which is cut a little bit higher. And what we're going to do is we are going to measure from the open shoulder seam, and you'll need a flexible measuring tape to do this. You can see I'm not getting a 100% accurate measurement, but it's very close. Okay, so my neckline is 18 inches. Now we want to cut a neckband that is approximately 80 to 90% of this distance, okay, of that measurement that we just took. Now you might say, why 80%, why 90%? Well, it's because depending on how stretchy your fabric is, that's going to determine how the neckline looks. So if you have really stretchy fabric, you're going to want to go closer to that 80%. If you are stretching your fabric and it only has a 20 to say 40% stretch, you're going to want to stick closer to the 90% because you're just not going to be able to get a nice laying neckline if you're cutting it too short. So 10% of 18 inches is 1.8 inches. Okay, so you can write those measurements down if you want. This fabric that I'm using is on the less stretchy side. Okay, so I'm going to cut this first neckband the 90%, which means I'm going to cut it the my measurement of 18 inches, subtracting 1.8 inches, which is going to give us about 17.4 approximately. Okay, so you can cut it a little bit longer and then adjust if you want, or you can try to cut it exact. I'm just going to get this fabric sort of straightened up to begin with. Okay, so the other determining factor that you want to consider is how wide you want your neckband. I prefer a narrow neckband. I also think this helps it to lay better along the neckline. So I would suggest cutting your neckband 1.5 to 2 inches, no more than 2 inches. That's my personal preference. So I'm going to cut this one about 1.25 inches. I'm sorry, yeah, 1.75 inches, sorry. Okay, 1.75 inches, and we said we wanted 16.4 approximately. Okay, so I'm laying it out along my measurement, 16.5. We're going to go just shy of that. I do not add additional length for seam allowance. Okay, I just do my measurements straight up and then I sew it on. So now that we have our neckline or our neckband cut the correct length, we can pin or clip it to our t-shirt neckline. So we're going to lay our t-shirt with right sides up. Okay, right sides up, and then you're going to take your neckband and you're going to fold it with the wrong sides of the fabric touching. So we have the right sides of the fabric out. Okay, and I like to pin it or clip it to both ends. This allows me to see how much I need to stretch in the middle. So right now I'm clipping it to both open necklines, the open shoulder seam. Okay? After that, we need to stretch it to find a middle placement. This is where I wish I had a third hand, but usually I'll just stretch it and then sort of walk my hands in and find a place there in the middle to clip it. And now you can go ahead and pin or clip at least one more center place. I would suggest when you are first doing this to clip more than you think you need. Okay, it doesn't hurt to put in extra pins or extra clips as you're doing this. As you gain confidence, you will be able to put less clips or less pins, and sometimes I will even just cut my neckline and then stretch and sew it as I go and not pin or clip at all. So it's kind of just a learning process and a learning curve as you get going. So now we have a neckline pinned on, and we can go ahead and sew that. So we're going to go back to the serger and sew the neckline to the neckband to the t-shirt. Okay, so because I didn't cut my neckband very wide, I'm not going to trim off a lot of this fabric as I'm sewing. So with the serger, I'm just going to kind of sew where it barely trims the fabric and then stitches along the edge. So what you want to do is you want to stretch the band to match the neckline. Okay, and that's why we have those pins or clips along the way, because that helps guide how much is stretched at a time. So you're lining up 3 pieces of fabric, 1 of the t-shirt and 2 of the neckband. And as you're sewing, you want to make sure that you are not stretching the t-shirt, you are only stretching the neckband. So I like to just sew a few inches and then make sure that I have everything lined up and continue to sew. Again, you are just stretching the neckband, you're not stretching the shirt fabric. Okay, then I always like to take a final check and open up the neckband and make sure that I did catch all the layers of fabric. Every once in a while I will have a small hole along the neckline where I didn't catch it properly, and now is the time to be able to go back and do that. So you can top stitch your neckline with a double needle, a zigzag, or a cover stitch. I'm going to demonstrate this one with the cover stitch. And you can either do it while the neckline is still open, or you can sew the shoulder seam and then top stitch. Again, because I'm showing you the easiest way to do it, I'm going to top stitch it with the cover stitch while the neckline is still open, because that is easier than when it's in a round circle. Okay, so this is a cover stitch machine. This one can do either a single cover stitch or a double cover stitch, which means we can have a looper on the top and the bottom, or just the bottom, and we can have a chain stitch of a single thread, a double stitch, or a triple stitch. So right now I just have the looper on the bottom, which would be like your ready to wear t-shirts that you're purchasing, and then there's 3 threads that will stitch along the top. So we want to, when we're top stitching, we want to fold the seam allowance of the neckline down towards the shirt, not up towards the band. And then we want to stitch, if you just have, of course, a single needle, you want to stitch on where that seam allowance is folded over. If you have a few needles like I do, 1 or 2 will be on that seam allowance, and then 1 will be additionally off to the side. So you're going to just line it up. Again, I will demonstrate this using just a sewing machine on the next one. You can see that my stitching is along the neckline. My stripes are not cut super straight, which is giving an illusion. But then on the back, we have both the serger stitching and the cover stitch stitching for a nice finished look along the back neckline. And then you have a full finished neckline, and the last step is to sew up that final shoulder, and then you'll have a t-shirt with a finished neckline. Okay, we're gonna walk through this all one more time using just the sewing machine so that those of you who don't have a serger or a cover stitch can still achieve a very similar look. Okay, now we're going to walk through the same thing again using only a sewing machine. So if you do not have a serger, that is not a big deal. You can still go ahead and make this. So I've already gone ahead and sewn up the single shoulder seam using a knit stitch, which looks like a lightning bolt, on my regular sewing machine. You can also use a narrow zigzag to sew up, but you want any of your stitches that you're sewing with knit fabric to be actually stretchy. So you need to not use a straight stitch. It needs to be a knit stitch or a narrow zigzag. Okay, so then we go ahead and open up just as we did before. This time we're going to reuse that neckband that I cut off an old t-shirt, and it is stretchier than my shirt fabric, which means I'm going to be cutting closer to that 80% number than I did on the last t-shirt. Okay, so using your flexible measuring tape, you're going to measure the neckband, and I get 14 inches. Okay, so this is a smaller neckline than the previous one was. So 14 inches, 10% of that is 1.4 inches. If we double that, we're looking at taking almost 3 inches off our 14 inches. So we would be cutting close to 11 inches. So sometimes what I will do is make it a little bit longer. So instead of just 11 inches, I would say, okay, we're gonna cut this, 11 and a half to 12 inches, just to give ourselves a little bit extra, and we can always trim if we feel like it's not long enough or if it's too long. Okay, so I've picked out as many of the old threads as I could from this old neckband, and we're going to pin this on or clip it in the same way that we did before. Okay, so at both shoulder seams, and then we're going to stretch it. This time we're stretching a little bit more than we did last time because we've got a shorter neckband, but it's actually going to lay just as nice because it's pretty stretchy fabric. So once you've sort of pinned in the middle, then you can add 1 or 2 more on each side of that center, trying to line up your 3 . And knit fabric, does like to curl, so make sure you're uncurling it when you're pinning or clipping it. Okay, and now you have a neckline that we can go ahead and sew. And because this will need to stretch over a child's head or your head, you do want to make sure that it's done with a really good stretch stitch. So I don't even really trust the knit stitch, which I'll show you what that is. I like to use a narrow zigzag when I'm sewing necklines just to make sure it's really a very stretchy stitch. Okay, so here are the options for a stretch stitch. This little lightning bolt thing is technically the stretch stitch on your sewing machine, but for this one, we're gonna use a zigzag, and then we're gonna adjust the settings. So we have length and we have width, and I'm gonna make it just a little narrower to make it nice and stretchy along there. Okay, so now we're gonna sew the neckline. With not using a serger, you are going to want to make sure you have a little bit wider seam allowance. So if you need to adjust how wide you're cutting your neckband, so you can sew a little bit more in, then you can go ahead and do that. So of course we're going to start our stitching. We want to make sure we back stitch. I'm using the edge of my presser foot as my guide, and I'm pulling my fabric here to make sure that this ribbing, the neckline, the neck binding fabric is stretched to be the same length as the t-shirt. Again, we want to make sure we're not stretching the t-shirt fabric, just the binding fabric. Also stretching a little bit, we'll make sure that it's an even stretchier neckline. And I have had so many people who Don't do this and then one time putting this t-shirt over someone's head and the threads just pop. So we do want to make sure we're using a nice stretch stitch on here so that this will not break when we stretch it over our head. And back stitch. Okay, and then again, check to make sure that your t-shirt doesn't have any holes in the neckline. And we have a really nice start here to our neckband. Okay, one of my absolute favorite tips for getting a great looking finished neckline with your regular sewing machine is to use a twin needle. So if your machine has a toggle on off for a twin needle, you can go ahead and switch that on. It's not absolutely necessary, but if it has it, then I usually add it. Then the only other thing that I've done is gone ahead and load a twin needle onto my sewing machine, and you can see all the details for using a twin needle, how to thread it, my thread suggestions, and all those things on my knit hem post, which is linked into the blog post on this tutorial. With no special machines. We just need one different needle, and I also am using a stretch thread in the bobbin called bulky nylon or woolly nylon, and you can find all those details in the blog post. And just like when we did with the cover stitch, we have the seam allowance of the neckband folded down towards the t-shirt, and we are stitching on that seam allowance, and we are trying not to stretch out this neckline while we're doing this. So I'm just using a straight stitch, but because I have the stretch thread in the bobbin and because I'm using a twin needle, this will actually become a very stretchy stitch. And before I had my cover stitch, I did loads of necklines like this on shirts that my kids wore for several years, and we were able to get by just fine without threads popping. So again, there's lots more details on using a twin needle and this technique in the hem post on Life So Savory, and you can also find the link in the blog post. With the double needle, you are able to backstitch, so you can go ahead and do that before you finish. And then you can go ahead and see that we have a really nice looking top stitch, and on the back you can see that the woolly nylon sort of zigzags back and forth, which allows this to still be a really stretchy, nice neckline along the way. Okay, so then you would, as normal, take your open shoulder, stitch it up, and you would have a finished t-shirt neckline.